All right, so I'm just going to kind of scroll through the PowerPoint for you that you missed today. We'll start out with muscle tissue. Again, there's not a whole lot to write down. It's just kind of to show you everything. But function of muscle tissue is just to contract the fibers inside the muscle cells, contract and shorten the length of the cell from end to end to produce movement of some kind. 3 overall types of muscle tissue. We have skeletal, cardiac, and smooth, that all have different appearances and different functions that you need to recognize. So we'll start out with skeletal. Skeletal muscle is what you normally think of with muscle. You can voluntarily control the movement of skeletal muscle for the most part, except for some reflex movements. It attaches to the skeleton, usually through tendons, and it pulls on bones. Some actual skeletal muscle attaches directly to the skin. If you've ever seen horses that have like flies that land on them and their skin twitches, it's because of a muscle attachment directly to the skin. And I think we have a couple of those as humans as well, but not as many as some other animals. But produces gross body movement, so overall body movement that you can observe, or facial expression. There's a lot of muscles in the face that help you to smile or frown or make silly faces. But characteristics you need to know about to recognize in skeletal muscle. It has striations, which are stripes, banding patterns that you see in the muscle fibers themselves that make up most of the bulk of the cell. They're multinucleate, meaning they have more than one nucleus. And the overall shape, I don't think this is in your notes, so you probably want to write this down. They're long and cylindrical. They're classically called cigar-shaped cells. So here's the picture from your textbook and a microscope slide of a muscle cell that's magnified 195 times. So you'll notice that there are multiple nuclei. And these nuclei, that's kind of the darker purple staining area. You notice the nuclei are kind of squished out too. They're not round like they are in some cells. And they're classically called boxcar nuclei, because it kind of looks like if you were overhead, like a railroad yard or something, and you saw these boxcars that were stacked up along the railroad tracks, one after another. That's kind of the rough appearance of these nuclei in a skeletal muscle tissue. But each of these individual, pieces of fiber is a single muscle cell, and you can see that clearly the stripes that are present. Also notice that the fibers run parallel to each other. They don't really cross or intersect. They pretty much just run in straight lines. All right, second type of tissue we'll look at is cardiac muscle. Cardiac, unlike skeletal muscle, is involuntary, right? Of course, it's in the heart, hence the name cardiac. But you don't obviously consciously control your own heartbeat. It's something that is controlled involuntarily. And of course, the function is to contract and squeeze and decrease the volume inside the chambers of the heart to force blood through blood vessels out through the aorta and to the rest of the body. So some characteristics of these cells: they're striated just like skeletal muscle cells. They do have stripes, but they are uninucleate, so they just have single nuclei. The length of the cells overall is pretty short, and they branch. So like when we saw the skeletal muscle cells back here, again, they ran in straight lines. These things are going to branch, so you're going to see these little things that look like V's or Y's. Also, they have these features called intercalated discs, which are basically where one cardiac muscle cell joins to the next one. And those are areas that have some gap junctions, which, if you recall, those are the little tunnels between cells that allow chemicals to diffuse from one cell to the next. And that's really important for the function of cardiac muscle, because cardiac muscle has to allow electrical signals to travel from one muscle cell to the other, because cardiac muscle has its own electrical conduction system to control the heart rate. So here's the pictures from your book. Okay, I'll focus more on this one on the actual microscope slide over here. You can still see stripes, kind of like with skeletal muscle, but you notice that the fibers are much more random in direction. They're kind of running into each other and they're branching, and you don't see as many nuclei, right? You have one nucleus per cell, and the cells are shorter. Like there's a cell that starts here and it ends like right here. Okay, they don't run all the way across the microscope slide like they do for skeletal muscle. And these darker purple areas, that's where you can identify that one cell is touching the next cell, and those are called the intercalated discs. But again, look for the branching fibers, smaller number of nuclei, and intercalated discs to identify that it's cardiac muscle. Last type is smooth muscle, all right, also called visceral muscle. It's also involuntary, like cardiac muscle is, but it's not in the heart. It's in other organs. So hollow organs like the stomach, the uterus, the intestines, and also in the blood vessels themselves have a small layer of smooth muscle. All right, and it is involuntary. When smooth muscle contracts, if it does it in a rhythmic way, kind of like if you're trying to squeeze out water from like a t-shirt, from like one end of the organ to the other, then we call that peristalsis. It's kind of like a wave of contraction that moves down a hollow organ. And that's a very typical way that smooth muscle will contract. But some characteristics that you can identify: there's no striations, hence the name smooth. You don't see any stripes on smooth muscle. They're uninucleate, similar to cardiac muscle, and they're spindle-shaped. So they're kind of thicker in the middle, and they get skinnier towards the edges. That looks quite different than your cardiac and your skeletal muscle. Okay, so here's the diagram in the book. You can see they're thicker in the middle, one nucleus, and then when you look to like this one, you can see it's getting skinnier over here at the edge. This is not the best picture. I don't love this picture from the book because they're so kind of crammed in. But one way you can identify it is just the color looks different. It's a little bit more kind of pinkish, reddish. And again, it's not the best picture, but this is going to be your smooth muscle. Okay, last type of tissue you need to know about is nervous tissue. Now, this is the best one because there's only one type of nervous tissue. So this is pretty easy to know. But it's made up of neurons, all right, and also there's some support cells. So the neurons are the actual cells that are kind of like the telephone wires that are connecting and sending and receiving signals from one part of the nervous system to the next. So they're really what you're interested in. But there's also support cells that are there to kind of help the neurons to have a good environment and be stable and do their job. So the function, of course, is to receive and transmit electrochemical impulses to and from all the parts of the body. So there's two traits that nervous tissue has, or neurons. They're irritable and they are conductive. And we'll talk later about what those two things mean. The support cells that are around the neurons are called neuroglia. Glia means like glue. So they help to kind of stick the tissue together. They act as insulation, kind of like you can imagine the rubber that's around like a copper electrical wire. They also protect and support the neurons. Okay, so here's the image from your textbook. The cartoon's pretty close to the real microscope slide on this one, but the large cell is going to be your neurons. Okay, they're kind of star-shaped. Okay, they have these kind of sharp, pokey edges to them, and a large central cell body with a dark staining nucleus. All right, and then you'll see these smaller nuclei that are out in the periphery. These are going to be the nuclei of the glial or supporting cells. You'll notice that there's these long kind of arms that stick off of the neurons, and these are called processes, and these are basically where there's like a small little bit of cytoplasm and cell membrane that extends way out to some other neuron that's somewhere else in the nervous system. So that's how the neurons can actually send signals and talk to each other, by sending little electrical signals that shoot through those long processes at very high speeds. Alright, so there's a figure in your textbook, 3.22, that summarizes all the tissue types. I got a computer's acting kind of funny here. I'm just going to try to ignore that. But anyway, this is a good one to study, just to summarize all of the tissues in the body, right? So, of course, you can pause the video here and read through this stuff on your own. But remember, you got 4 major tissue types, so you want to know the major functions and examples of where you're going to find those tissues and what job they have in the body. Okay, so a few things that kind of go at the end of the notes, some special things that you should know about tissue. So repair can happen in 2 ways. One way, the preferred way, is regeneration, where if you have tissue that's damaged, then, like, imagine a burn, for example, on the skin where you have the top layer of skin is damaged, where surrounding cells that are the same type of the cells as the ones that got damaged regenerate. So they're basically just replacing themselves. So you end up with tissue that has the exact same function and structure of the original cells that were damaged. Second type of repair, and this is not so preferable, is called fibrosis. So this would be what you end up with if you have a 3rd-degree burn. By definition, like a 1st or 2nd-degree burn, the skin can regenerate, so there's no permanent damage to the skin. But if you have a 3rd-degree burn, then you get a scar, because the entire depth of the skin, which is stratified squamous epithelium, is destroyed. So once you destroy the entire depth of the skin, then you don't have any cells left to divide and regenerate themselves. So then you get some other cells that come in that are going to build fibrosis, dense fibrous connective tissue, which is called scar tissue. And this can happen in a lot of places in the body. For example, after a heart attack, the portion of the heart that's deprived of blood flow will have a permanent fiber scar over it, which is why if you have a heart attack, even if you recover, your heart doesn't function as well, because that cardiac muscle tissue is now replaced by scar tissue, which doesn't contract, and so you have part of your heart that's not doing what it used to do. All right, so those things, whether you get one or the other, depends on both the type of tissue and how severe the injury was. Like I said, a 1st or 2nd-degree skin burn is going to you'll get regeneration and you'll get full recovery of the tissue. But if it's a 3rd-degree burn, you'll get fibrosis and scar formation. Also cuts. Okay, if a cut's like clean in a straight line, imagine like with a scalpel, then you tend to get a much more successful healing, tissue regeneration, than if it's a very ragged tear of tissue. So events that happen in tissue repair. When tissue is damaged, the capillaries, which are the tiny blood vessels, get very leaky, very permeable, and so that results in a leakage of both blood and protein out from the bloodstream into the damaged area, and that triggers a series of events that causes clots to form. All right, and those clots wall off the injured area to protect it and isolate it. Then you get this granulation tissue, which are some cells of the immune system and the inflammatory response, cause some things to happen. You get new capillaries grow, which helps to bring in more blood to the injured area. You get phagocytes, which are those cell eaters, which help to eat up and digest and get rid of the blood clot and some of the fibroblasts, which are building some of the scar tissue. And then you'll have cells that rebuild collagen fibers. So they'll build up new connective tissue to help repair and hold the area together. All right, the surface epithelium will regenerate. Okay, like this is if you get a scrape on your skin. Okay, eventually that scab, which is the scab itself, is made up of collagen fibers mostly and blood clot. All right, when that scab falls off and detaches, you have healthy epithelium that's regenerated underneath it, and that whether the scar lasts permanently or if it's invisible and goes away depends on how severe the wound was in the first place. But tissue that regenerates itself easily is going to be your epithelial tissue, so skin, mucous membranes, connective tissue, and bone regenerates pretty well. But tissue that doesn't regenerate very well is skeletal muscle if you have like real damage to a muscle in, for example, like a car accident or something, or an athletic injury, that is hard to regenerate. Other tissue that is very hard to regenerate is cardiac muscle, like I mentioned with the heart attack. That tends to be replaced with scar tissue, and nervous tissue. So I'm sure you've heard about, people who have devastating accidents, car accidents, or spinal cord accidents, football players who have severed spinal cords in their spine that become like permanently paralyzed. That's because the neurons don't grow back, they don't regenerate. So you end up with scar tissue in the spine and a loss of nervous function that can be permanent. Developmental aspects, this is the last little part of this. So growth by cell division happens all the way until puberty. That's how you get bigger, is the cells just undergo mitosis and you get more cells and more cells. You have some cell populations that are constantly exposed to friction, so your skin, the lining of like your digestive system, constantly those cells are rubbing off and they're dying, and they just get replaced by cell mitosis. Connective tissue also remains in mitosis and can form repair tissue throughout life, but for the most part, muscle tissue, when you hit the end of puberty, becomes amitotic, meaning it loses the ability to divide. So pretty much by the end of puberty, you've got as many muscle cells as you're going to have. And of course, it's possible that you could increase your muscle mass. You go work out a lot in your 20s. You're done with puberty, but you can still increase your muscle mass. But that happens not as a result of muscle cells dividing. It's just that the muscle cells you already have grow larger and develop more fiber within each cell. Okay. Nervous tissue is amitotic shortly after birth. So that means when a baby is born, they basically already have all the neurons they're going to have for life. So pretty much it's kind of a depressing thing, but throughout life, when your neurons die, and you can look up the statistics about how many neurons on average a human brain loses per day, but when those neurons die, they ain't coming back. So in a sense, you've got as many neurons, good neurons right now today as you're ever going to have. But fortunately, we can function pretty well with a fraction of the neurons that we're born with. So it's not something that's devastating until you get to really old age, and if you develop something like Alzheimer's, which can be pretty nasty. All right, but amitotic tissues like your neurons and your muscle cells can be really handicapped by injury because they don't have the ability to divide. So that's kind of a good take-home point. Overall cause of aging. Aging is studied a lot, but nobody really knows exactly what causes aging in an organism over time. But it's a pretty strong theory that there's a lot of chemical and physical insults or damage that comes from the environment that's just natural. It occurs over time. And also there's some genetic programming. There's some changes to the genes. Genes get damaged and mutated over time because of exposure to things like sunlight and just the chemicals that your body generates, the free radicals that your cells generate. So over time, those things can contribute to cell aging and eventually to cells becoming just older and also dysfunctional and predisposed to developing various cancers, which is why most cancers have age as a big risk factor. As you get older, you're more likely to get them. So speaking of cancers, neoplasms, that's the medical term for cancer. Neo means new and plasm is tissue, so a neoplasm is new tissue, but it's something that shouldn't be there. It can be benign or cancerous depending on how aggressively it grows and also whether it breaks and spreads to other tissue. But these are abnormal cell masses where the normal controls of cell division are not working. So instead of the cell going through mitosis and then interphase and the long rest period before it re-enters mitosis, in a neoplasm it may undergo just repeated phases where it just goes through mitosis, 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 and you end up with this big mass of cells in a very short period of time that's unregulated and growing. Hyperplasia is simply an increase in size of a tissue. So that can happen if the tissue is really strongly stimulated or irritated. So this is what happens if you lift weights. If you lift especially heavy weight, football players are basically doing this on purpose, trying to increase the amount of skeletal muscle tissue at different key muscle groups in the body. But if they're very heavily stimulated, if they're used very frequently, then they're going to increase in size. And the opposite of hyperplasia is atrophy, right? So this is what happens if you don't use a muscle for a significant period of time, if it's not stimulated. For example, I actually had a pretty severe knee injury when I played football in high school, and I had to have essentially like a soft cast over one of my legs for about 7 or 8 weeks. And so basically I couldn't use the muscle in that leg because I couldn't bend the leg at all. So when they took the cast off, that leg was a lot smaller. The muscle was just a lot smaller because I wasn't using it. And that's just kind of a natural thing that happens when you don't use muscle. All right, so that's the end of the notes right there. Just make sure that you study the diagrams in the book, especially the microscope slides for all the types of muscle tissue, because you'll be expected to know those on the test, just like you'll need to know epithelial and connective tissue. So that's it for the notes. Thanks for watching, and let me know if you like looking at notes this way, if you like having a video available on YouTube. Some people find it really helpful to be able to pause and go back and watch a video kind of in their own time, as opposed to watching in class where you might tune out for 3 minutes and then you have no idea what I'm talking about. So let me know if you like this. I'll make more of these. If you hate it, then I won't bother. But anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.